Good afternoon. This is Beth Wadham from the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education, and welcome to our October webinar on contemplative pedagogy and deep listening. We're here with David G. Haskell, Professor of Biology at Sewanee University of the South, and we're going to begin in just a couple minutes. So for our new participants, I just want to go over a couple features of the webinar before we get started. As you'll see, you have this control panel on the upper right of your screen, and you can open and close that using the red arrow in its left corner. When it's open, you might want to do that if it's not open, you'll see that there's a questions pane about halfway down, and there's where you have an option to type in questions or comments. You can type them in any time, but Professor Haskell will not be addressing them until after the presentation. And he'll be speaking for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for your questions and comments. So we're delighted to have Professor David Haskell with us. He's been a member of the biology faculty at Sewanee since 1996 and holds a degree in zoology from the University of Oxford. You might hear a little mild Scottish accent. And a doctorate in ecology from and evolutionary biology from Cornell. His teaching at Sewanee has become known for combining class material with action outside the classroom, exploring biodiversity in the field and working in local food banks. And he has been named Tennessee Professor of the Year by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. It looks like 4 times in the past 8 years. So the things you find out about people when you Google them. David received a Contemplative Practice Fellowship in 2005 for developing a course on food and hunger. And he is taught at the Center's summer session on contemplative curriculum development. And thanks again, David, for sharing your experience with us today on contemplative pedagogy and deep listening. And now I'll turn the webinar over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Beth, for that very kind invitation and introduction. It's an honor to be with you this afternoon to talk about my experiences with contemplative pedagogy and deep listening. I'm going to move, I'm having a little technical issue while I move the slides forward. Here we go. So first, let me tell you a little bit about my context. Beth gave you a little bit of an introduction, a very kind, overly kind introduction to my background. I teach here in Sewanee in the biology department and also in environmental studies. And Sewanee is a small liberal arts college. We're a residential liberal arts college with about 1,400 students, mostly students in the age bracket 18 to 22. We're a liberal arts college, so we just have undergraduates. I don't have any graduate students or postdocs. There is at Sewanee, there's also a graduate school of theology that's under the same university umbrella, but is a separate administrative structure from the liberal arts college, which is has a curriculum like most liberal arts colleges, emphasizing a broad grounding in the liberal arts and sciences, and then areas of specialty, the standard majors. And so, for example, we have majors in environmental studies and biology and English and international studies and so on. My own academic background is in ecology and evolution, and in particular in the study of diversity within the animal kingdom, both behavioral diversity, species diversity, acoustic diversity, and lately some work with genetics as well. I also have a lifelong personal interest in agriculture. I've been growing food since I was a little boy, and continue to do that with my wife. Now we have a small farm and raise food for ourselves, and she runs a small farm business as well. I have in terms of contemplative interests, I have a 10-plus year meditation practice. The plus is vague in that I've sort of early on did meditation on and off. For the last several years, it's been more of a twice daily regular practice. And for a number of years, I wondered how I could apply both of those interests to my professional activities. And break down the barrier between who I was at home and the things that I thought were important in terms of my own development and integration into the community, both in terms of the physical integration, that's agriculture, we are what we eat, of course, and in terms of my meditation practice. If those were important to me, why weren't they part of my professional activities? And so today I'll be talking about, in particular, how that relates to my teaching. So before I jump into discussing the details of the teaching, let me give you some more background and context. I've also been doing some contemplative work in my writing and scholarship. I have a book hopefully coming out in the next year called Forest Mandala, which is looking at the science and nature in 1 square meter of old-growth forest. And here I'm taking a contemplative approach to communicating scientific stories to a general audience. So I watched this 1 square meter without manipulating it, without coming to it with a particular agenda for what I wanted to see or do, without doing any experiments or taking things back to the lab or killing things and so on, just watching to see what would happen. And then back to the writing pad and writing essays about that. And that's been a very enriching experience for me as a scientist. It's really opened my eyes to many more aspects of the community of life than I was aware of as just through my more standard work as a scientist. I'd be delighted to talk to anyone about that after this seminar or through email. But for now, I'm going to focus more on contemplative practice and pedagogy. And in particular, 2 courses in which I've used contemplative practice to try and enhance students' engagement and to get students to listen deeply, both metaphorically, listening to the world, and literally becoming aware of the acoustic landscapes that they're in. One of those courses is Food and Hunger, Contemplation and Action, and the second is Ornithology. And I'll discuss each of these courses in turn. So the Food and Hunger course. The academic material for this course examines both local and global patterns of food production, hunger, malnutrition, and poverty, and looks at agricultural ecology both locally in the U.S. and then globally. The course starts with a focus, a very local focus, looking in particular at poverty and hunger in our own community. We read papers and books about the working poor, the causes of hunger in our area. Sewanee is located in Tennessee, which is an extraordinarily rich agricultural area, and yet there are people who cannot feed themselves day to day in our community. Sewanee is a fairly well-to-do university, and yet there are employees, or at least subcontractors of employees here, who also have a problem feeding themselves day to day. So how can this be, to be in a rich, financially rich place, but also a rich place in terms of soil and productivity, and yet we have hunger? That's the local issue. Of course, on a national and particularly on an international scale, there are much more dire patterns of poverty and hunger, dire to the point of course, people suffering severe malnutrition and dying from a lack of food. And so we look at those issues and read papers. Of course, there are lots of hypotheses about what can be done about this, about the causes, but we look into the science and the economics and the cultural context of some of these patterns. We also connect this a little bit to ecology and look at some of the trends in, say, sustainable agriculture and organic agriculture, and think about the controversies about those. Is organic agriculture just a thing for the rich people who can afford it, or is this really part of a solution that could be applied globally to help people out of hunger and poverty in places where hunger and poverty are rife, are endemic? So that's your academic material. In one course, we of course cannot cover all of these different issues in any depth. So I try to give the students both a general overview of the main issues and then go in some particular depth into some questions, especially those questions that relate to our local region here. So there's the academic material, and then 2 other very important parts of the course are the action and contemplation. I'll talk more in more detail about both of those. just briefly, the action part involves students working in the local food bank and poverty assistance center and doing other hunger-related projects on campus. So getting out of the classroom and working with people in a way that's not radically different from other service learning projects on other campuses. I prefer the term community engagement rather than service learning. It seems to be a more wholesome thing to engage with the community than just to serve, which implies a certain power structure. So there's an action portion, then there's a contemplative part of the course, and this is woven in with action and academic material, as I'll describe in a moment. But the contemplative portion, in brief, involves contemplative sits that the students do both in and out of class, so periods of silence, and contemplative reading. And it's important to me that both contemplation and action are present in this course, rather than it just being about action or just contemplation. To me, the two go together. And in fact, one of the themes of this class is an examination of the historical association between contemplation and action, and the modern association between contemplation and action in our own society. For example, in many religious traditions, contemplatives, people who engage in a contemplative, take on a commitment to a contemplative kind of life, are often the same people who are involved in action to alleviate poverty. And so the question is, why is that? Is that just a fluke, or is there something deeper going on there? And so we examine this in the course. I also think, just as from my personal experience, that contemplation and action go together the way the inhaling and exhaling go together, or the drawing in of blood and the sending out of blood from the heart. The two aren't different things. They're the same. They're different parts of the same process: listening and acting, inhaling and exhaling. So let me give you a little more detail about the action projects, then we'll move to the contemplative aspect. So students prepare groceries at the local food bank. They deliver groceries to clients. Sometimes they even prepare meals and deliver those meals to the clients' homes as well. They pick up and deliver food from a regional warehouse. And warehouse is probably an understatement. This is a mega warehouse in Nashville that supplies poverty action centers all over Middle Tennessee, and it's phenomenal to see the amount of food that's going through that warehouse. In some ways it's very impressive. In other ways it's a huge monument to the failure of our economy, that there are so many hungry people that we can have this enormous warehouse full of busy people doing good work, but good work that is alleviating some things that perhaps could be solved through other ways if we didn't have if we weren't embedded in a structure that caused so much hunger in our communities. So students work with the food bank, and both locally and in the regional sense. They also prepare, organize, and put on a Thanksgiving meal for all the clients of the food bank. This is a Thanksgiving meal for 100 or more people. Obviously, that is quite a challenge for anyone. I would quake in my boots at the thought of solo preparation of a Thanksgiving meal for 100 people, but the students take this on. The class is about 15 to 20 students. They divide up the various tasks, and they've done a very good job of doing this. A particularly good job, since many of them have never actually really cooked anything before. So this is an education in learning some important life skills, like how to cook a turkey, or how to make some cranberry relish, or even just how to cook potatoes in order to make mashed potatoes. They're all picking up the phone to call home to find out how dad and mom and granddad and grandmother and aunts and uncles have gone about preparing Thanksgiving meals. So there's some interesting sociological outcomes from this. So they put on this meal for the clients. They also do a hunger banquet on campus for a different clientele. This is a banquet put on for their peers, for faculty and staff, and for community members. And attendees of the banquet show up but don't know what kind of food they're going to get. A small number of people will get a very nice meal, the kind of meal we would expect to get going to a decent restaurant. There's a starter and an entree and a nice wait staff and some nice drinks and a dessert, and it's all very nice and completely unexceptional in the context of what we privileged Westerners eat every day. But that's just a small number of people, and those people are sitting up on the raised stage. Then another group of people are eating rice and beans, sitting on chairs around that stage. And then a third group are sitting on the floor with an inadequate supply of rice. And the portions that people are given in proportion to the actual dietary intake of people across the globe. So as you know, there are hundreds of millions of people living on inadequate food. And so we get to experience that just for one meal at this hunger banquet. And it's a lottery which of those three categories you end up in. I had some trepidation about this, that it would just be too obvious and just not a good experience, but it turned out that the students did an excellent job, and we learned all sorts of things like the role of smell. If you're getting the little bowl of rice and you can smell the food coming from the rich folks' table, that produces all sorts of feelings within you that are rather interesting and provide some good food for discussion. The students don't just put on the banquet, they're charged with coming up with some discussion points or a little PowerPoint display of slides or some informational brochures just to make people attending the banquet aware of some of the trends within our own society and across the world in food availability. The really important thing with these action projects, particularly those that involve working in the food bank, is for students to engage with people, in particular clients of the food bank. So I try to encourage them, and the director of the food bank also does a marvelous job of this, to encourage them to move beyond the kind of easy tasks behind the scenes, like washing up the dishes or bringing the bags in and cooking the food, working with your own peer group within your comfort zone. It takes some more courage to go out and sit and look people in the eye and talk with folks over a Thanksgiving meal, people who are from very different walks of life, different socioeconomic classes, maybe different mental health status, certainly different levels of affluence. One of the side effects of poverty is that people get divided off and shunted off and become invisible in society, and basically often get, particularly in rural Tennessee, very little human contact. Still less any human contact that is respectful of their personhood. And so one of the things that I try to encourage students to do is to go out and actually interact with folks and honor them with just conversation. And to me, that's as important as the other things, the food theater and the learning how a food bank works and so on, is to actually engage with people and go beyond the barriers that we all live behind. So the contemplative aspects of the course are really two main components. The first is contemplative reading that we do together in class. And here I use an adaptation of group Lectio Divina. Lectio Divina is a way of reading texts that was developed within the Christian monastic traditions, where people will read things that they consider to be Holy Scripture in a way that really went deeply into short sections of text rather than reading an awful lot in one go. So, for example, instead of reading a whole book out of the Bible, you just pick out a few verses and sit with those and give voice to them and contemplate them. What we're doing in this class is not reading religious text. It's reading mostly, in fact, almost exclusively, I think, secular text, discussions about food and hunger, but I'm trying to use this Lectio Divina as a way of encountering those texts in a contemplative way. And I'll walk you through how we do that in just a moment. The other thing we do is breath, mindfulness, or centering prayer. And again, after I've discussed the contemplative reading, I'll come back to those practices. So contemplative reading. Here's how we do this. First of all, we all come either with a photocopy of an essay or with an essay that's taken from a book of a collection of essays that we're using in the class. I've picked ahead of time one paragraph from that we're going to focus on. Usually it's the last paragraph, but it may be some other. Then as a class, we read the whole essay aloud, each person reading one sentence. So I might start with the first sentence. The person on my left then reads the second sentence. The person on their left, third sentence, and so on. So we go round and round until the essay is finished. Then we take some silence, maybe a minute of silence. Then somebody reads aloud the last or whatever other paragraph that I picked out ahead of time, reads that aloud, and we take some more silence. Then I invite responses from the group, and these responses are just one-word responses that are given from not from discussion back and forth within the class, but from our own reactions to the text. So it might be a word that really struck us in the reading, or it may be some word other word that we come up with in reaction. The key is we're responding to the text and not agreeing and disagreeing with other people's responses. Then we take some silence. Then another person reads aloud the last paragraph again, take some silence. And then I'll invite one phrase or sentence responses from the group. And again, we're not disagreeing or agreeing with what other people's sentences are. We're just hearing our own individual responses to the text. Then after a little quiet, we have one last reading of the paragraph, some silence. And then the class ends. Or we take a pause and start some new activity. What we don't do is then go back to the usual classroom mode of discussing and dissecting and agreeing and disagreeing and so on. We just let that Lectio Divina style listening to the text be for what it is, and we move on to something else. So what are some of the benefits of this contemplative reading? And I'll have to say this is when I first offered this course, this is the practice that I was most nervous about. I didn't know how this was going to go. Was it just going to be a horribly embarrassing, silent experience and the students would have just hated it? My experience was it wasn't, and it's actually the thing that I thought was the most rewarding and surprising of all the different projects that I undertook in this course. And I'll outline for you some of the reasons I think that is. I will say also that students in the class write a variety of essays. And they do a term paper and they do essays on their contemplative practice and on their action experiences. Although we don't get into a dissection and an extended analysis of these Lectio Divina style readings, these are the readings that they return to in their texts, and they seem to have sunk in and really, they seem to have really heard them in a way that I don't find they come back to many of the other essays that we read in a non-Lectio Divina fashion, in a more standard academic analysis fashion. Those are important. That is a complementary way of listening to other people's writings, but students don't seem to respond in the same way. So Lectio Divina lets us spend some time in a text. It's like swimming slowly through a text rather than speedboating across it, and then getting the speedboat out and hitting another lake and speedboating across that. We're taking some time in the text. We get to hear the diversity of our responses. Different people in the class will have very different word and sentence responses, and that's just very interesting to hear that diversity within the classroom community. We also hear the diversity of our voices. The physicality of sound is quite remarkable and quite beautiful, hearing how different people read the text. And I tell the students ahead of time, we're not trying to reenact some kind of solemn reading of a sacred script here. It's okay to stumble over your sentence. It's hard just to pick out a sentence and read it well aloud. It's okay to do that. If there are amusing things that happen in the text, it's okay to giggle and so on. We hear the diversity of all those physical reactions. We also hear how our own responses change as we spend time with the text. The first time we hear it, we may hear one thing, the next time another. And so by spending time and listening, we really can sink into and listen in a deeper way to what's happening in the text in our own mind, as well as hearing the diversity in the classroom. So in other words, we're involved in, I hope, deep listening, both to the text and to the community, the classroom community. So now, the contemplative sit. In class, we do short periods of either breath, mindfulness, or centering prayer. And the breath mindfulness practice involves resting our attention on the breath. It might be the physical sensation of the breath coming in and out through the nose, or the breath as it rises and falls within the chest. Then, when our attention strays, as it invariably will, from that attention, from that resting on the breath, we bring the attention back to the breath. And we do that over and over again. And that's the practice. Centering prayer is a method that I offer for those students who have a particular theistic view of their role in the world and their spirituality. Centering prayer involves picking a word that acts as a symbol of your intention to be open to the presence and action of God within you. So the word is a symbol. The word is not an active prayer. And then, in fact, it helps if the word is something that isn't emotionally loaded for the particular person who's doing this practice. So the word is a symbol of your intention to be open. You let your attention rest on that word. When your attention strays, as it invariably will, and you notice that, you gently bring your attention back and rest it with the word. So both of these are practices of silence, and they're practices of attention and resting with one's attention on a particular thing, whether it's the mindfulness of the breath or the symbol of our intention. I do this in class at the beginning of the semester to teach the methods for students to use outside of class. To open some space in the class. Silence is a beautiful thing for opening space and allowing people to enter into the community, the classroom. And also to raise questions about the practice. Should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? I'm not floating away on my magic carpet feeling calm. Am I doing something wrong? No, you're not. We can raise those questions and address them in class by doing this practice together. Then students outside of the class, for several periods a week, pick one of these practices, whatever feels comfortable for them, to take some breaks of silence through their week. So I tell them this is like an assigned reading, except the reading is just to become aware of your own interior landscape through one of these practices. The students keep a log. That's just a record of what kind of practices they've been doing and when. And they also keep a journal, and I do require them to show me their log. The journal, most of them do share with me, but some of them don't want to, either because they haven't really done much with their journal or because there are private things in there. And that's okay, and that's explicit from the start that they'll have that option. So why do we do these sits, and what are some of the benefits? Well, to listen deeply, we need a place of quiet within ourselves, particularly when we're dealing with hunger. To truly hear the painful stories of hunger in our own community and around the world, we need some place to be where we can receive that news, where we can hear it without being bowled over into apathy, switching off because it's just too much, or into a frenzy of despair or action or anger and a sort of knee-jerk response from that. So we need a place just to be, to hear this. Then we need a place to know ourselves a little bit and a place of quiet to discern our response, if any, to what we're hearing. In other words, to put a little bit of space into our lives so we can hear what's happening in the world, we can hear what people are saying about what's happening in the world, and then we can reflect on how we might respond to that. To me, those are the two core benefits of these practices. There are others. One of them is being present, just some mindfulness in the classroom and in our lives helps us be present for the text that we're reading, be present for one another in our classrooms, and in particular when students are doing action projects, it helps them to be present for the people they're working with there. These practices may also develop the empathy in students to see themselves in other people, to see that this poverty is really something that could happen to any of us. We can all be hungry. And particularly in the U.S., we know that any one of us could wind up in the line outside of the food kitchen depending on the particularities of our circumstances. We need some empathy and some space to stand back to see that these are not different people. We're all part of this, and we could all be in that position. Contemplative practices can also develop some courage to allow people to go beyond barriers, to actually connect with other people. And I mentioned this before, the courage to go and sit with people who you would normally not feel comfortable about conversing with, partly because you're worried about, well, they're just going to judge me, and they don't want to talk to me, and I'm just from some other zone, or I really am uncomfortable about the way that person is moving. They seem to have some mental issue, and I don't want to deal with that. All that chatter can be let go, and we can just go out and experience some contact beyond the barriers. And last, I don't emphasize this point much in the class, but I think it's one that some of the students do make for themselves, is that the idea of hunger can be expanded to all forms of privation. We're all hungry in some sense, and contemplative practice can make us aware of our own hunger and make us aware of the incoherences in our own life that are producing hunger that may not be physical, but it may be some other, perhaps just as important hunger. So contemplation and action, I mentioned it was very important to me that both of these were in the class. As I've mentioned already, the class examines this association between contemplation and action, both through our readings but also through our conversations with people in our community here. Is this connection something that is a causal connection, or is this a connection that is just a fluke, or there isn't really any correlation at all? It's just Professor Haskell making it up. Any one of those conclusions is fine for the students to reach, as long as they can defend their arguments, and as long as they have reached that conclusion in part through their own inner experience of that. It's one thing to read about the connection between contemplation and action and perform a clever analysis of that. It's another thing to go out and experimentally assess that association for oneself by engaging in contemplative practice and engaging in action in the community. And many of my classes are science, so-called science classes. I think the division between science and other disciplines is mostly an artifact of our balkanized departmental structure in modern higher education, but for what it's worth, scientists do an awful lot of experiments, and for me this class is an extension of that experimental idea into a field that is perhaps not always approached in an experimental manner. So there's this history of association that we examine. Of course, Engaging in action in the community around hunger is a form of active learning that helps students engage with the class material. But more than that, I think it may reveal new truths. There's only so much we can learn just by reading about things. By getting out and actually interacting with people who are hungry and people who are working with the hungry, we may learn things that professors writing in Science magazine or in sociological analysis of hunger may not realize, and that's important to be open to that. And the alternation of quiet, of contemplation, and activity, of action, is, I think, an inoculation against two sides of the same coin, and that is apathy, the pulling away from the world, and burnout, which is engaging with the world, but to such an intensity that we can't sustain it. If we can inhale and then exhale, and there's a balance there, we can be neither apathetic nor burnout, but we can actually work effectively over the long term. This alternation is also an antidote to our culture of frenzy and haste. And of course, we all know that that culture is particularly well developed within the academy. There's nothing wrong with activity and action. That's what we should be doing. But when it becomes a fire, a frenzied motion that burns us out, that seems to lead just to more and more frenzy, we know we're doing something wrong. So some alternation of quiet and activity, I think, is a healthy way of approaching this. So we connect action, contemplation, and academic material in the class through class discussions, and particularly through class discussions. Students and I discuss in the class, how does this contemplative practice, this practice in the community, relate to the academic material? Class visitors, both colleagues, academic colleagues, and guests who are working in NGOs and other food and hunger-related activities in our community, come and talk about these connections. Many of them have contemplative practices of their own, and of course they're all engaged in action in the community. Students write essays, or they have the option of using other forms of expression like artworks, to reflect specifically on their contemplative experience and the relationship of that experience to the action projects and to their readings. And they write more general essays about themes from the class that often weave together action, contemplation, and academic material. So assessment of student performance, everybody's favorite topic. We're required at the end of the semester to line students up along a linear scale and assign a letter or number to them. Of course, that doesn't necessarily correspond to the wisdom and insight that might come through contemplative practice and work in the community. However, those contemplation and action and the students' GPAs may grow together as well. The grade in this class is not based on my assessment of how contemplative they are or so on. That we can't judge that. The grade is based on their ability to articulate responses to the readings, responses to their experience of action and contemplation. It's based on their ability to engage with the material, to deliver action projects. So they get graded on how well was that Thanksgiving meal organized. That's a group grade, and the hunger banquet likewise. And on their ability to communicate insights both orally and in written form. And I won't go through this grading breakdown here. I just included it in case anyone wanted to flip through and examine it in more detail later. But I will point out that there's a mix of oral presentations and written work, including reflections on the action and contemplation part of this. So action and contemplation are not peripheral parts of this class. They are built right into the core of it. And that's reflected in how students are assessed. Let me close my discussion of food and hunger with a few additional reflections. I think where practices like centering prayer have clear religious connections, we really have to make multiple options available, and that's very important to me both personally, and of course it's important to our institutions that don't want to be proselytizing particular religious views. There are plenty of contemplative practices out there, including breath mindfulness, that are not loaded with theistic theology, and those are appropriate to bring to the classroom. Another thing that perhaps should not have surprised me, but did, was the extent of misconception out there about what contemplative practice is about. A lot of students were expecting, after the first class period or two, to have a calm mind, to have an empty head, a clear mind to float away on waves of calm and contemplation. And of course, as anyone who's been involved with contemplative practice knows, that's not what it's about. What it's about is becoming aware of what's happening in your head and developing the inner resources to be present for other people and present for oneself, and to have some little space between action and reaction in our lives. In fact, calmness is often not the first fruit of contemplation. The opposite is we become aware of how uncalm our minds are. But that awareness is a useful product. So pointing that out to students and being open to and aware that students are going to be bringing these preconceptions to the classroom is important. And last, I've phrased all of this in experimental terms. You've heard me talk that way already. I invite students to conduct an experiment with these contemplative practices and with action in the community. And then I make very clear that it's okay for them to reject this, to conclude from this experiment that action in the community and or contemplation have no relation to the academic material. In fact, they're swimming the wrong way and there's a big disconnect. It's okay for them to conclude that. And in their essays, if they conclude that, they just need to provide some supporting arguments, as do the students who fall in love with contemplative practice. So let me talk now about the ornithology class, and I'll be talking more briefly about this class. The ornithology is the scientific study of birds. We cover all sorts of material in this class. The particular area that I use contemplative practice in is as a method of developing acoustic awareness, particularly in relation to learning bird songs. Students in this class have to learn 80 different species of birds. Well, they have to learn they learn more species than that, but they have to learn how to identify 80 of them by sound alone. And that's a hard thing for most of us to do. We're not well trained in how to open our lives to the acoustic nature of a bird song, and particularly to remember what those sounds are week by week. More generally, though, acoustic awareness opens us to the soundscape that's relevant to many different academic disciplines. For example, in environmental studies, the study of environmental justice, you can learn an awful lot about environmental justice in a community by looking at where the sounds are. Where is the noisy interstate routed? Where are the quiet places in town? How the machines and economic activity affect soundscapes in natural areas. All these are questions that transcend just the science of birds, but connect out into many different areas. And through your own disciplines, you may also see some other connections, say to a literary awareness of or ability to communicate through literature or poetry, the feeling and the sense of a place. The soundscape can be very helpful and important part of that. Lastly, we have an interior soundscape, plenty of chatter in our minds, and I think these practices can make us aware of that, although that exploration of the interior soundscape is not something that I focus on a great deal in the class. So there are 4 exercises. I'll run through them quickly. The first one is naming. We listen to the sounds around us. We become aware of them. And as we notice them, we name them. Car, bird song, air conditioning unit. And every time we name something, we don't dwell on that name. We then redirect our attention back to the soundscape. So you become aware, you name, and then you go back to awareness. From this, we learn that there are many more sounds around us than normally enter our consciousness. They disappear when we're not paying attention, And even when we are paying attention to one sound, we tend to filter out the others. So this is a fairly simple, basic practice that reveals the nature of our attention. Then I ask students to describe sounds, and these are exercises that we do together in class and outside when we're in the field. And I ask students to do these on their own as well a certain number of times each semester. For describing, we let our attention rest on the soundscape, but we don't name them, we describe them. The rhythm, the volume, the texture. And this opens us to the physicality of the sound itself, not to its name or its label. And this physicality is an opening into awareness of our judgments of sound. For example, we hear traffic noise. We don't hear noise. We label it immediately. Traffic noise, it's bad. I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling angry about those trucks again. If we open ourselves to just the pure physicality of it and don't label it or judge it, we can realize that sound is sound and our reaction is a different thing. Then we move to just hearing. We let our attention rest on sound when our mind wanders or names things or describes them. We let those thoughts go and return to the sound. This is an experience of the sound, and we're letting go of internal commentary. This isn't an experience of pure sound, which our nervous systems are still filtering and so on, but it might give us a taste of what that pure sound experience might be. And last, we do an experiment, a practice with interior hearing. We use our imaginative capacity to call to mind sounds and hold them there. So we think of a bird species, a Carolina wren, a crow, or it might be a sounding object like a piano note. We bring that to mind even though the sound is not present physically. We listen to the sound, we rest our attention on it, and when our attention moves away, we bring our attention back to the sound again. So this is an exercise designed to develop recall and to help with the imaginative capacity as it applies to sounds. So some reflections about acoustic awareness exercises. By far and away, increasing acoustic awareness has been the most life-changing part of this class for many students. I get a lot of comments, sometimes several years after the class, for students whose lives have really been changed, and I can relate to this. My life was opened up when I became aware of bird sounds. It's like a new dimension being added into one's life. So the three components of that awareness are awareness of the community of life in which we're embedded. All of us have been hearing these sounds, these bird songs, for decades. And yet, for most of my students, they've never heard them before. They've never noticed them, let alone identified the species. So this class helps them, and these exercises help them become aware of the sounds, and then putting names to them, say, knowing that that's a Carolina wren or a winter wren or a song sparrow, that opens up an awareness that the world is not about humans. It's a community of life with multiple species in it. And that community of life is richly variegated across the landscape that we live in. And acoustic awareness really opens that up to us. Birds and most other animals are quite inconspicuous visually, but their sounds ring out all around us. So awareness of the community of life is the first and main fruit of these practices. It also increases awareness of the soundscapes of everyday life, the hum of the air conditioning unit or the heating unit outside of the dorm, the different sounds of wind in pine trees and oak trees and maple trees, how trucks sound as they roar past us on Saturday night. All these things are part of our soundscapes. Becoming aware of them increases our awareness of the nature of the world. And lastly, we can become aware of how sounds are filtered and judged by our minds, and how our emotional and intellectual responses to sound are very much driven by this judgment and filtering, not necessarily by the sounds themselves. I think that's a general insight that can be applied in a number of different spheres within our lives. So let me offer one last overall reflection. Contemplative practice, in my experience, has opened me up, and I think it's opened my students as well, both to the utter brokenness of the world, thousands of people every day dying of hunger, and simultaneously and paradoxically to the inexpressible beauty and joy of the world. And to be able to hear both of these things simultaneously, and then to have a place to discern how we should respond to both the brokenness and the beauty, that has deepened and enriched my classroom experience and the classroom community that I'm involved with immeasurably. And I'm grateful for that, and it's been an honor to share a few of those thoughts and insights with you this afternoon. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, David. I can just imagine how much your students learn from you with those exercises. I think it's just they're so skillfully developed and really appropriate to the classroom. So it was wonderful to hear about that. I know we have some questions that people have been typing in while you've been speaking, and now we can turn our attention to those. I'm going to make sure that with the technical move that you have to make to open up that pane so you can see them, I'm hoping that
I am working on that right now.
Functioning. But we can take a look there, and we have over 50 people attending. It's wonderful that we're all connected this way and have been applying our attention to what David has been sharing with us.
Okay, so perhaps the best way is if I just read out some of the questions.
Yeah, our listeners won't be able to see the typed-in questions, so if you choose one that you'd like to address and just read it out, then everyone will know.
Yeah, I'll sort of go down them. And
Great.
One question is, do you take a position on the issue of government interference with such areas as a soda tax and oversights of an individual's desire to partake of fast foods and so on? My personal position on this in the classroom is I don't take a position. What I hope to do is to open the classroom to those questions. For example, and often it comes down to local issues. The students here have a certain number of food options to them available in the dining hall. What should those options be? And soda is often one that seems to evoke quite a bit of emotion. Some people really want and need their Coke at lunchtime. Other people don't want their student fees to subsidize somebody else's Coke habit, as they put it. So we get into those debates. I think my role as a teacher is to put in some information there. For example, if there are debates about nutrition, the nutritional value of sodas, well, let's look into the scientific literature and see what nutritionists say about sodas. And we don't get into the particularities of taxation. That's a key idea, but that's not something that we deal with in this class. I know other classes at our school do that. And in particular, my course is focused very much on hunger, and soda is something that a lot of the people at the food bank, although they might want it, they can't afford it. It's just too expensive. However, the sort of fast food, junk food issue is a major issue in many rural areas and in poor urban areas. Often the only food available is what we might call fast foods or junk foods. It's very hard to get fresh fruits and vegetables. And so we talk to people in NGOs and farmers and other people to understand why that is and what might be done about it. I do agree, though, that a taxation on those kind of foods would preferentially weigh heavily on the poor rather than the wealthy. So I think that there's a very important justice issue wrapped up in that particular question.
Yeah.
let me take another question here just so we can
Great.
get this level. What determines the kinds of text you would use for Lectio Divina, and what kinds would you use for traditional analytic discussion? That's an excellent and I think very important question. Some texts, I think, do not lend themselves to Lectio Divina. An example of a text that I would not use would be, say, a reading from Science magazine that's discussing the latest debate within the USDA about the shape of the food pyramid. That's an important debate, and we do read those readings. It tends to be very fact, policy, and science-oriented, and reading that in a very deep, thoughtful, deep listening way, there's not much more to that text than what's on the surface. The point of it is to communicate some information about a sort of ongoing debate within USDA. The kind of text that I would use is the one that has, in my opinion, some more depth to it. Say somebody relating their personal experience with working with hungry people or their personal experience of hunger to economic challenges or ecological challenges, questions that don't have simple factual answers, where the personal, the political, and the ecological all get wrapped up together. Those are the kind of text that I would use for Lectio Divina. So that's a good question. I think we have to be careful about where we use Lectio Divina, not because it could be misapplied somewhere, but just because it's a deep way of reading, and if the text isn't particularly deep, you're not going to be getting much extra from it.
Give them something worthy of that attention.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, nice. Well, we have time for just a couple more probably. We'll need to wrap up right about 4 o'clock Eastern time.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Sure. Here's another question. I'm a professor at a community college, and I'm concerned about introducing these practices, and that might be construed as teaching a religion. What do you suggest? The first thing I would suggest is to find other colleagues who are interested in this and engage in some conversation about what might or might not be appropriate in your own particular context. Some schools have a very strong code about not involving anything that vaguely smacks of religion anywhere near the classroom. Other schools have a little more leeway there. My suggestion would be not to involve the religious traditions, but if you're interested in contemplative practice, to choose practices, as I mentioned, something like breath mindfulness, and then to explain clearly why those practices relate to the learning objectives of the class and why those practices are helping deepen students engaging with that material. Just throwing in some contemplative practice because we think it's a good idea and we want students to start meditating is the wrong approach. Our classrooms are designed to do certain things, that's to teach biology or history or English, and we need to be, the contemplative practice has to serve those purposes. But again, going back to my first point, engaging with some conversation with people who are familiar with the particularities of your own situation, I think would be the first place to start.
Thank you. Great. So maybe if you want to choose one more that might be able to take a short response, and then we'll be
there's several questions.
I know. There are a lot of questions, honestly, and there's some very good ones. So we may be able to prevail upon you, David, to look at them, and we could post some responses, when we are recording this webinar, and we will archive it on the website. So it's possible that we could address some of them.
I'd be happy to
great.
continue later.
Nice.
Let me take one more question now. And that is, how supportive of your teaching practices is your department? And some other folks had asked, how supportive are your colleagues or the institution? I think within my department I haven't had any resistance. I haven't had a stampede of people wanting to do what I'm doing in their own classrooms. And that may be because I haven't been proselytizing this particular method of pedagogy heavily within my own department. However, more broadly within the institution, there are a number, probably half a dozen faculty members who are very interested in contemplative practice, and I've had conversations with many of those about the particularities of what I do, and then learning from them what they're doing, say, in English or in religion or in history, how contemplative practices might be woven into their particular context. I think as long as contemplative practice is clearly connected to the goal of excellence in teaching and helping students learn and engage with the material, people have no ground to stand on saying that we shouldn't be doing this. If we're proselytizing religion, then of course they do have some legitimate concerns there. But I think contemplative practice, like any other pedagogical method in the classroom, as long as it's coming from the right place, that is a desire for excellence in teaching, I think should get a considerable amount of support.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think this is the gesture of serving rather than evangelizing is an important distinction, and
Right.
I can really see how, from your description, that yeah, the students are well served. It enhances their understanding really of this course content, and they're very precise in that way. That's wonderful.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah. So thanks so much, all of you who joined us today, for being part of the webinar. And I just want to make a brief announcement about the next one. We've set our sights on Wednesday, December 1st at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And Peter Schneider, Professor of Architecture at University of Colorado, Denver, is going to present Architecti et Usas Meditatio. Or for those of you whose knowledge of classical languages has lapsed, that's Architecture and the Use of Meditation, Vitruvian Echoes in Contemplative Practice. So it'll be another 1-hour webinar, and the registration is up on the website now. We will send out more information about that. But once again, thank you so much, David Haskell, for sharing with us today, and we will be, as I said, posting the webinar in a week or so to the website so you can share it with others. All right, thanks, and
Thank you.
farewell. Farewell until we meet again.